Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
Essentially, when a president is behind like this, he almost always loses. But, almost always sometimes doesn't apply to Donald Trump.
Hello and welcome to Chopper's Politics, the Telegraph's weekly political podcast, normally hosted by my esteemed colleague Christopher Hope. Not this week, though. Chris is off camping, and he's made the brave decision to hand the podcast over to me for the next couple of weeks, as all eyes fall on the US presidential election. I'm Ben Riley-Smith, the Telegraph's US editor and host of our podcast, Crossfire. This campaign has been upended by coronavirus, killing more than 160,000 people in America, turning a booming economy into a recession, and making the election all about leadership in crisis. The next fortnight will see first the Democrats and then the Republicans hold their conventions when Joe Biden and Donald Trump will formally be picked as presidential nominees. These are huge moments in the campaign calendar, a chance for each party to project their policies and values while also framing their opponents in the worst possible light. This episode will look at the Democrats. I'll be talking to Hillary Clinton's former political director, who played a big role in the 2016 campaign, about why conventions really matter, and to a man who advised Biden in government to reveal what he's really like. But first up, I gave Larry Sabato a call. Larry's one of America's best-known poll readers, director of the University of Virginia's Center for Politics, and writer of Sabato's Crystal Ball, which looks at what's really happening in US political races. I started by asking him to explain the exact state of play with less than 3 months to go until the vote. Characteristically, he didn't mince his words.
We're in the strangest election of the post-World War II period, probably one of the 2 or 3 strangest in all of American history. And it's strange because of the pandemic more than anything else. We're used to bad economies from time to time. But the pandemic has been a disaster for Donald Trump, a disaster for America. And right now we're headed for the worst record of any country in the world. So that has suspended a lot of the normal politics. We don't even have real conventions. I've been to every convention in both parties since the early 70s. And this will be the first year I haven't attended anything because you can't attend. It's all online or on TV. It's mainly going to be talking heads, politician talking heads. I can't imagine it will change very much.
And lay out roughly where the polls are, because Joe Biden is quite clearly ahead at this stage.
Yes, Biden is ahead. It's not insurmountable, and I'm not just saying that because of 2016. It really isn't insurmountable. His average lead, polling average lead, is around 8%. I'll be surprised if in the end he wins by anything close to that, if indeed he wins at all. When you're president, as Trump is, you have the opportunity to create some October surprises, and they already have several in mind. We'll see whether they work. But right now, Biden is ahead, but Biden is ahead because the American public does not want Trump to have another 4 years. These 4 years have been chaotic. In many respects, in foreign policy and domestic policy, he's been a disaster. They also don't like the way he insults practically everybody. So that's the advantage that Biden has. If he could continue the campaign with the ballot reading as it does today, which is not Donald Trump. Biden is not Donald Trump. People know he was vice president. They have a sense that he's been in Washington a long time, and indeed he has. But they don't know all that much about him. He's kind of colorless and bland. Now, that's a plus running against Donald Trump if you're a voter and want to break from that. But obviously, the Trump people are going to have to try to define him very, very quickly and negatively.
That gap, that 8 percentage point gap, I mean, that is a big lead. And it's a big lead, especially when the person you're running against is an incumbent president. I mean, put that into historical context a bit. How big a lead is that running into an election?
This is a big lead, and it's a big lead not just historically, and it is historic in a sense because when a president is behind by this amount or more, he almost always loses re-election. That was true for George H.W. Bush. And by the way, he was behind at points in 1992, far beyond 8 percentage points. It certainly applied to Jimmy Carter in 1980 when Ronald Reagan defeated him. But you can continue going back. Essentially, when a president is behind like this, he almost always loses. But, almost always sometimes doesn't apply to Donald Trump. So you're going to find analysts pretty hesitant to come right out and say, boom, the election's over. We did that in 2016, and most of us will never forget it.
Well, that's what I was about to ask you, actually. A lot of people do say, listen, I remember 2016, Clinton was way ahead in the polls, it was over 2 months before, and then Trump won. How comparable is this situation to the Clinton situation at the same time? Is Biden about the same place Clinton was, or is he further ahead?
No, it's about the same. For example, this weekend, CBS came out with a couple of polls in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and Biden was leading Trump by 6 points in both. And remember, those are two of the states that put Trump over the top in the Electoral College. So we went back and looked to see what the situation was 4 years ago, and it was almost identical. Clinton was ahead about a half a dozen points in those two states. But here's the difference. Biden has steadily been ahead. There has not been one single moment that has been polled where Trump was ahead of Biden. It's always been Biden ahead. His lead stabilized in April, May, June, and it's been maintained about where it is. It's dropped a little bit, and that's to be expected as the conventions approach. And that's Trump's problem. People have made an evaluation of him. They don't want him. 4 years ago, he won because he wasn't Hillary Clinton. It was Hillary Clinton versus not Hillary Clinton. And as controversial as Trump was, Americans in the key states, at least, decided that they wanted to give a try to somebody else because they thought they knew what they could expect with Clinton, and they didn't like it. They didn't want it. So in a way, this is kind of the opposite of 2016.
So if we're assuming the polls are right and Biden appears to be ahead at this stage, what do you think Trump would need to do to bring it back and to win on election day? I mean, there's talk of what would happen if a vaccine was declared before voting day, or the economy begins to pick up and you see sudden increases in job numbers. What do you think would be needed to get him over the line?
Well, I've been saying for a long time that we're going to get a surprise announcement somewhere between mid-October and the end of October. It may be real, it may not be real, but we're going to have Trump or some of his people or some of his medical advisors, who are generally shunned but will be trotted out in the White House, to declare that the vaccine is a certainty. That works beautifully, is not only in development, but it's almost finished and will be distributed in the United States by the end of the year, January at the latest. Nobody believes that. Nobody believes it. But for his supporters, it will be enough. They don't need much. They already like to love him. And what's going to happen with the stock market and the economy? Assuming they buy what Trump says, you'll get a jolt, a positive jolt, at just the right moment before the election. Now, that assumes also that Trump has been able to define Biden in a very negative way. And he has lots of attack plans. And again, we found out that Biden is simply the name on the ballot. And people who are tired of Trump or hate Trump or think Trump's policies are terrible are going to vote for anybody. They would have voted for Bernie Sanders, for God's sakes. But Biden is an acceptable alternative, even for some moderate Republicans.
Last question, Larry. You write something called Sabato's Crystal Ball. I want you to peer into the crystal ball and say how likely it is that Joe Biden will win this election.
Well, I don't think there's anybody in politics that would predict that Biden would lose at the moment, or that Trump would win. But I think it's much more competitive than most people do. I watched very closely as Trump managed to fool just about everybody in 2016. And if anything, his techniques have improved because he's had so much practice and he has the White House. He's got hundreds and hundreds of people at his beck and call to help him as he plans this campaign and executes it. And Biden is 4 years older than Trump. Trump is 74, and frankly, that's too old to be president. But Biden is 77, and he would turn 78 before he's sworn in. We're running a retirement home, really, for politicians in the White House. But I think that Trump seems to have more energy on the campaign trail. He doesn't show his age as often as Biden does. So there are a lot of factors here. People are going to get impressions in the 3 televised debates that we're supposed to have. So, people who predict this early frequently don't just have egg on their face, they have omelet.
That's great. Larry, thanks so much for joining us.
I enjoyed it, Ben. Thank you very much.
Okay, don't go anywhere. In a moment, I'll be talking to Clinton's former advisor, Amanda Renteria, about what happens when conventions go wrong.
Sick of gotcha political coverage?
Tired of the endlessly cynical news cycle?
Secretly think that most journalists are on another planet?
Do we have the show for you? Join us on Planet Normal, a Telegraph podcast that speaks your language.
Bringing you news and views from beyond the bubble, with columnists Alison Pearson.
That's me, and Liam Halligan.
That's me.
I finally learnt what a podcast is, and even how you can subscribe to one. It's actually very simple. Search Planet Normal on your podcast app, or click on the link in the show notes from this episode.
You could say one small step for me and Alison, but one giant leap for normal people everywhere. Bit much?
Yeah, when aren't you too much?
If you want to know what it's really like to take on Donald Trump in an election, there's only one place to go: the Hillary Clinton campaign. Amanda Renteria was by Clinton's side throughout that turbulent 2016 race, trying to smooth her boss's path to victory as political director. She agreed to share her thoughts on the importance of conventions, how the coronavirus pandemic has upended this year's planning, and what Biden really wants to get out of this week. Normally, tens of thousands of cheering supporters pack into a stadium to see the candidate accept the nomination. Balloons, applause, ticker tape. It's a huge event. This time, though, it's all online. We began by talking about what impact that would have on this year's convention.
A convention also has all these side meetings that happen and a lot of different energy of parties here at night and parties there and coffees in the morning, and the party in the state gets together before they go to the big convention hall. So that part is going to be missing, and that's what's going to be difficult to figure out now virtually. How do you create that energy both externally and then bring it all together?
Do you think it could actually have a benefit? Some people have been speculating that these conventions are kind of anachronistic. They're from another age. And if you have a made-for-TV convention, maybe actually voters are more engaged.
I think you could get, it's conceivable that you could get a broader audience, because you start with the premise that everyone's going to be watching. Whereas when you do these conventions, it's the party leaders that are coming together. You almost start with, okay, how are we going to make sure everyone's going to get along as we come together? So the premise is a little bit different. I think the other aspect that's interesting to think about is sometimes those external meetings create a little bit of havoc inside the convention halls. And this time, the campaign will be able to control the messaging a heck of a lot more. They'll be able to control the image, the public view a heck of a lot more. And I think that does help not only reach a broader audience, but to show the unification of the party, the unification of American values, and everything that really Biden is trying to get out there today.
Now, conventions don't always go as planned, and the experience you had with the Clinton campaign in 2016 was quite a turbulent one. Can you just tell us what happened at the last convention?
Yeah, I think everyone had some expectations that this was going to be a coming together of sorts. And I think there was still a lot of uncertainty and unsettledness, I guess I would say, within some of the parties. And so, as I described before, the external meetings before everyone came to the convention hall became a little bit more rambunctious, where people weren't ready yet to come together. There were still some policy issues that people wanted to work out. There were still some really unifying needs that had to happen before coming into the convention hall and really being together. And so it doesn't feel like that's going to be an issue this time around with Vice President Biden. But what will happen is some technical difficulties, which one could argue in Pennsylvania, we did have some problems with people getting from their breakfast hotels into the convention halls. So you did have logistics and traffic. I think this time around, you're going to have some logistics and technical difficulties that hopefully the campaign will be able to figure out.
Yeah, and I'm right in saying, in terms of the Russian meddling and the drop of all those internal emails, can you just talk us through what happened? Because that was right before the convention, right?
That's right.
So for those who might not know.
Yeah, so for those who might not know, right before the convention, the WikiLeaks emails basically displayed Chairman Podesta's emails all across the organization, which added to the intensity of the entire convention. And so not only was the campaign busy trying to bring the party together, but everybody was busy reading emails, internal emails about the different conversations that were happening and the different factions within the party. And of course, Russians and opponents had a good time highlighting that while we were trying to pull together a unifying message. That same thing can happen on social media. I suspect it will happen on social media. But the campaign will be ready for it. There's no illusions. I mean, even as we're walking into the vice presidential pick, the opposition research is out there. Everyone comes eyes wide open, ready to address both playing offense and defense at the same time, but being able to mitigate it and being ready for those surprises. You know, I think this campaign has learned from ours, from the 2016 election, that anything can happen, and recognizing that nothing is private and none of those emails are private. And if anything, you got anything out there, you better address it now and deal with it now. And we're seeing that kind of campaign as we speak. We're seeing things float out about the vice presidential candidates. I suspect any conversation that is happening internally with Vice President Biden, I am certain they're aware that anything can be pulled up and are conscious of not only their security that they have, but just in case being aware of what might leak.
We can already get a sense of what Trump is going to try and do with his convention in terms of framing and defining Biden on his terms. This idea that he's too old for the job, that he'll be in hoc from radical socialists, these types of things. Do you think part of the job of the Democrats this week is to preempt some of that stuff and flesh out who Biden is as a candidate?
It is. I think Biden has been out there. He's not a new candidate for anyone, right? It was a lot like Secretary Clinton in this regard, is people know him. They know what he's about. The need is to really spice up the energy so that people are ready not only to talk about his bio, but really ready for this intense election in pushing back against misinformation, in pushing back against what Trump is going to try to do in terms of divisiveness. I think that piece is imperative. And if you hear from the campaign today or anyone as a surrogate today, what you'll have heard even more recently is the uptick in saying, when you see misinformation, speak out. And we need everyone to be doing that in unison. When you see a doctored ad or campaign, speak out, because we need to make sure that we are louder than the misinformation that's out there. We need to make sure we are louder than the divisiveness that we're hearing out of Trump. I think that message needs to be incredibly important at the end, because there's going to be such a concern with misinformation. There's going to be such a concern with bullying at the voting booths or confusion about how to vote. And so we need to be unified in making sure we're pushing back. Mm-hmm.
So with this maelstrom to come in the next 3 months, the Trump attacks, the volume that he can generate, the coverage he can generate, what would be your key message to the people running Biden's campaign to make sure they win come November?
Number one, be ready for anything, and recognize that whatever you think is going to happen on Monday morning, it's likely to change that day. And the quicker and better the campaign is at being able to move on a dime and being flexible on when to respond and when not to respond is going to be an important aspect. Number two is we also the campaign also has to be on the offensive as well. Find the moments of surprise for this president. And then number 3 is, and I think this has been happening, is the Biden campaign making sure that they are listening to the people right now. The reality is what's very different from 2016 to now is there is a new voice in this election, whether it was the Me Too marches that happened early on or the Black Lives Matter marches that happened more recently. There is a segment, actually a growing group of just a people voice. And to the extent that Biden can tap into that as we go into the final days and weeks is going to be really important for the campaign. So although you might have a campaign plan, if you see something rising, for Biden to lead, I'd say in some ways almost lead from behind and take that energy in, I think that's going to be the real key to winning this election at the end of the day.
And last question, I know there's a lot of race to run, but do you think Biden will win come November 3rd?
I think Biden will win. I'm not sure it's November 3rd. I think this is going to be...
Because the result.
I think this is going to be a very shaky... end of the road here, and it might be decided in the courts. It might be decided a little bit longer. It's going to be chaotic for sure. But I do think good versus evil. I think good will win this time around.
Okay, brilliant. I love the Star Wars battle at the end there. How much do you really know about Joe Biden? In just over 5 months, he could be the most powerful politician in the world. Most people, of course, will know of the 8 years he spent as Barack Obama's vice president, his most prominent political role. But his career in Washington stretches back 5 decades. He's also had a life shaped by tragedy. He lost his wife and 1-year-old daughter in a car crash in 1972. He also saw his eldest son, Beau, pass away from cancer in 2015. Moe Vela worked with Biden from day one of his vice presidency. As Director of Administration, he gave his thoughts about Biden, the person, the politician, and perhaps the next US president.
Joe Biden is an incredibly consistent human being. And let me tell you what I mean by that. The gracious, empathetic, warm, loving, connective man you see in front of the camera is exactly the same man in a meeting with the door closed, in a meeting where we were discussing serious matters and policies, management issues and human resources issues. He just is so real, Ben. Mm. And, when I would ride in with him on Air Force Two, for example, and had the chance to get to know him more on a personal level and we became friends, you just can't help but love the guy. He's just lovable. Just embracing and warm and kind and just the epitome of grace.
You got to see Biden, the politician, and Biden, the personal man. Mm. Talking about the politician first, what was he like as the number 2 in the Obama administration? He's been in the White House for 8 years. What does his approach look like when you saw it up close?
Nobody demonstrated loyalty, in my opinion, better than Joe Biden has in public service. His respect for President Obama, his admiration for President Obama, his friendship with President Obama, all to me rooted in what I believe is one of the most important traits that we can possess as humans, and that's loyalty to one another. The other word that comes to mind, Ben, is humble. Humility is such a beautiful trait of Joe Biden's. To have served in the Senate at that point for 36 years and then come be the number 2, but to do it with such humility, with such grace, with such empathy, with such responsibility.
Mm. It's so interesting watching it as an outsider, as a Brit, between Biden and Trump squaring off, because they are such different individuals with these vastly different careers. Biden, Washington insider to a degree. He's been in the Capitol almost 5 decades. Trump, total outsider. His first political job was president. When you look at that matchup, what do you see as the key differences? Are they like chalk and cheese as individuals?
I find that there are, forget about the myriad and hundreds of political differences that are dramatic and very contrasting. As human beings, I don't know, to be honest with you, if you could ever have a more profound contrast between values. And I'll tell you the one that jumps out at me the absolute most in their differences as human beings. The vice president reflecting what I believe are traditional American values of decency versus a Donald Trump who peddles in hatred and division and racism, doesn't ever hesitate to call somebody a name, to bully people, to mock the deceased, to separate children from their parents. I mean, we could go on and on and on. The difference, Ben, is so dramatic that I can't even get my mind, my heart, or my soul around the concept that anybody in America is okay with his behavior.
One feature of Biden, the man, when you look back at his life, is it has been touched by tragedy. He lost his wife and daughter early on. More recently, he lost his son, Beau, to cancer. Can you talk a bit about that and whether you saw if this tragedy shaped him as a person?
I think that all of us as human beings are a product of our life experiences. To think that the loss the vice president has experienced has not impacted and affected him and made him who he is today would be, ludicrous. I didn't know him, obviously, when he lost his wife and his daughter, but when he lost Beau, I watched him handle it, rooted in his profound and deep faith, and also combined with this ability to stare loss, to stare pain in the face, and to use that faith to get back up and to know that in honor of those you lose, I think that's how he views it. You have to go on and have a purpose, as he says. And I think he gives, it makes him so real, Ben. It makes him relatable. It makes him a human being that we can all connect with. Any one of us who's lost a loved one can really relate to Joe Biden and connect with him in that shared loss, if you will. He's got this resiliency. As Kelly Clarkson once said in a song, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger."
And you can see that playing out in the campaign. His empathy, or what voters see as his empathy, is one of his great strengths, especially during coronavirus. People see that he understands the suffering more than President Trump understands the suffering.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. I mean, President Trump, who in the world would say it is what it is in regard to 160,000 plus innocent Americans having lost their lives? Who would say it is what it is? It is such a contrast to, as you point out, the empathy that Joe Biden exudes and he shares and he expresses. I feel horribly that the pandemic has kept Joe Biden from being able to be out on the campaign trail. Frankly, I think he has suffered more from the pandemic in that sense, in that political campaigning sense, than Donald Trump, because Trump relied on those enormous rallies, but he wasn't a one-on-one rope line, connect with the individual kind of guy. Where Joe Biden, people would come up. I watched it with my own eyes. I listened with my own eyes. Even when he was vice president, when I was working for him, I went with him to Chile and Costa Rica, and it didn't matter where we were in the world, but, people would come up and share their loss with him because they knew he had that empathy and he had that ability to be compassionate.
And can I ask, when you worked with Joe Biden, it was 2008, 2009, 2010. It's now 2020. He's 77. He'll be 78 on day one of a presidency if that happens. The Trump campaign has ruthlessly gone after this idea that he is somehow fading mentally, that he's not the man he was 10 years ago. Do you think there's any truth to that?
No, absolutely not. I find these questions about the vice president's mental acuity so offensive. I'll tell you why. Rather than us applauding him for overcoming a severe stutter. And in these years, as in his 70s, when people stutter, they'll all tell you, you never get rid of a stutter completely. He has to think before he says sometimes certain words and certain times and sentences. And so what they perceive as a mental lapse in the middle of sentences is most likely attributed to his having to think before he says things. And I find that so deeply offensive. I find it so offensive. It's so consistent with the wallowing in the trash and the mud of Donald Trump, who bullies everybody. But I'll tell you something. He won't bully the guy from Scranton, Pennsylvania and Delaware. I can tell you that. Bring on the debates. They think the vice president's scared of debating. He's going to wipe the floor with Donald Trump.
A lot of the listeners to this podcast will be British. Joe Biden is very proud of his Irish roots. He talks about it quite a lot.
Yes. Oh, there's no doubt about it. I'm of Hispanic heritage, Latino culture, and he, of course, being Irish American. So we often talk about the beautiful traditions and similarities of our cultures, how both Irish Americans and Latino Americans, we love family and community and faith, and we celebrate life. And so absolutely, there's no doubt he's proud of his Irish heritage and and the cultural traditions that come with it. And I think, again, it makes him relatable to other cultures and other ethnicities because, to see Joe Biden with his beloved Dr. Biden, Jill, his wife, and his children and his grandchildren, just to see him just reminds you of what's best of the Irish heritage and, frankly, just what's best of humanity.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, Joe. It's been, Mo, that's been really appreciated.
Yes, you're not the first to do that.
So that's all for this week. Christopher Hope must be the only person I know who enjoys camping for 2 whole weeks. But luckily for me, that gives us the chance to discuss the Republican convention on next week's episode. Subscribe to this feed to make sure you don't miss it. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please do take the time to leave the show a rating and maybe even a short review. Thank you to my guests today, Larry Sabato, Amanda Renteria and Moe Vela, and to the show's producers, Theodora Laludis and Louisa Wells. If you're all caught up on Chopper's politics and twiddling your thumbs, head to telegraph.co.uk/Chopper, where you can get 30 days access to all of our journalism, completely free. This week, I particularly recommend our deep dive on Kamala Harris, Biden's vice presidential pick, and why she's the Tony Blair of San Francisco, and a piece taking the pulse in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Biden's childhood hometown. We'll put those links in the episode description. One more plug. If you do still have the US political bug, please do check out my podcast, Crossfire. We looked at the British connections to the Russia-Trump spying scandal, hearing from those who saw it firsthand. If you want to get in touch with the show, maybe there's a guest you'd love us to talk to, the email address is chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or you can find me on Twitter @BenRileySmith. And always, please do buy your copy of the Daily Telegraph. Until next time, goodbye.